Hey there, Visualeconomik community, pay close attention to this chart. In it, you can see how the price of rent in the US in real terms has grown to accumulate more than 150% appreciation over the last 35 years. Yes, as many of you already know, the price of rent has been skyrocketing for decades. And although the graph we have shown you shows only the case of the USA, the truth is that this is a phenomenon that affects the entire West. For example, while in 2013, an apartment of 100 square meters, or 1,076 square feet, in the center of a European city like Madrid could be rented for about 1,100 euros. Today, the same apartment is rented for more than 1,600 euros. I know, it's really crazy. The worst thing is not that. Let's look at the US chart again. I want you to notice the new red line. This red line reflects nothing less than real median wage growth over the same time period. Notice that while rents have increased in price by nearly 150% cumulatively, wages have not even reached a measly 40% increase. In other words, everything indicates that housing is becoming an increasingly inaccessible asset for a significant part of the population. It almost seems that there will come a point where practically all of our salaries will be used just to pay the rent. And in this situation, the question is very clear. What on earth can we do about it? Is there any solution to the housing problem? Well, it seems that several politicians from around the world have a very, very clear answer.
Germany eyes ways to control rents as giant landlord emerges. Catalonia's new decree to control rental prices in tense urban area like Barcelona.
According to many politicians, talk show hosts, and professional experts, if you want to lower the price of rents, the solution is very simple. A maximum rental price must be set by law, a price that forces homeowners to rent their homes more cheaply. But is this a viable solution? And could such a seemingly simple and easy to implement measure solve the enormous problem of rising house prices? Well, judge for yourselves. Until not too many years ago, Berlin was one of those cities like Madrid where rental prices kept rising and rising with no apparent end in sight. The situation was almost at its limit. But one day, the government announced a new rent price control policy. That measure was announced on 4th of June 2019. And look at what happened to prices right after that. Indeed, the rent control measure in Berlin worked, and it works like a charm. In just 1 year after the announcement of the measure, prices in the German capital fell by up to 10%. But do you want to know the best part? The best thing is that there was another study done by different economists than the first one that analysed the same case and found exactly the same results. Berlin rents dropped 10% in price after the control measure. However, don't think that the Berlin case is unique. There are other cases of rent controls around the world that have proven to be effective. Without digging too deep, do you remember that a moment ago we showed you the news headline that Catalonia began to regulate rents? Well, in that case, prices fell by 6%. In addition, in another study looking at other rent controls in the city of San Francisco, economist Rebecca Diamond found that people living in regulated rentals stayed in them 20% longer than in other housing. As you can see, all these academic studies, which by the way we will leave references for in the description, seem to make the advantages of applying price regulations to rents very clear. However, wait a minute, because in spite of all this optimism, I'm afraid there's something we have to tell you to keep in mind. This building you see on the screen is the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago, Illinois. At this university, there is a research center called IGM, the Initiative on Global Markets, which, on a fairly frequent basis, conducts surveys on various economic topics. And guess what specific topic the IGM decided to survey in 2021? Yes, that's right, the price control of rents. And take note, because the survey was not conducted on the street among ordinary citizens, but among the most prestigious economists of US universities. Economists were asked the following question. Do you agree that rent price control has a positive effect on the economy? Well, pay attention to what they answered. Of all the economists surveyed, only 1% agreed that rent control is beneficial to the economy. To which you may ask, how is that even possible? In other words, the evidence and the studies we have just seen are clear. Price regulation serves to create a more accessible housing stock and improves the living conditions of the most needy. So why on earth are virtually all economists against such measures? Is there something we're missing? Well, the truth is that yes, there is. Pay attention.
The masked effects.
Let us return for a moment to the Berlin case. In this case, as we've already seen, two different studies showed that after public control, the price of rents fell by about 10%. Well, in one of those two studies, the following graph was also produced. This represents the number of homes that were for rent before the rent control measure was announced. As you can see, on average, around 625 new ads were published every week in the city of Berlin. However, look at how the landscape changed when the new regulation came into force. After the price control was passed, the number of new homes put up for rent plummeted. In a way, it was as if homeowners had suddenly decided en masse to stop renting their properties. This was also confirmed in the second study, which found that the supply of rental housing in Berlin collapsed by about 52% after the regulations. So the question is, why did rental offers in Berlin drop so drastically after the regulation? Well, according to the authors of the first study, this basically happened for two main reasons. The first is that since they could not set high prices, some owners simply preferred not to rent their houses, and perhaps sell them or simply leave them empty so as not to continue paying maintenance. The second reason is that political instability and the fear of future regulations made many landlords prefer not to rent their homes for a while. Although it is possible that this was only a short-term effect that would be resolved over time. Be that as it may, I'm sure that after seeing this, many of you are asking yourselves the question, is this just an isolated case? Has it happened in other cases that after rent control is introduced, the supply of housing has been drastically reduced? Or is this something that has only happened in Berlin? Well, the truth is that it has happened elsewhere. In fact, what economic theory predicts is that, in general, after setting maximum prices below the market price, many sellers reduce their production volume, in this case, the number of homes offered for rent. But beyond economic theory, this is something that has been statistically proven in studies conducted in cities such as Boston in 2007, San Francisco in 2019, or in a broader 2020 study that analysed the effects of rent price controls in 60 countries over the years between 1910 and 2017. Again, we'll leave the references in the description so you can see for yourselves. However, yes, before you say it, there are other case studies that do not get the same results. There are some studies that find no reduction in supply following the application of rent controls. And in part, this is because, in reality, prices are not everything in a rental. For example, imagine that you are a very greedy landlord and you want to keep making money, even though by law you are forced to lower the rental price. Well, one thing you could do would be to recover that money by investing less in the maintenance of the property, asking for a higher security deposit from the tenants, or perhaps forcing them to assume additional costs such as homeowners insurance. You know, for every law, there is a loophole. A case study of what we've just told you was found in a study done in 2015 that analysed the effects of a German rental law. What was found was that after regulation, prices fell in the short term, but the number of rental properties in poor condition increased by 3%. Be that as it may, and apart from the exceptions, in most cases, the studies point out that price controls have negative consequences that must be taken into account. The main one being that the supply of housing is reduced. Now, what does it matter that there is less supply of houses for rent? In other words, what matters to citizens is that the price of housing is low. It doesn't matter if there is more or less supply, does it? Well, I'm afraid to tell you that it does matter, and it matters a lot. Check it out. In Stockholm, one of these cities with intense rent regulations, citizens have to wait an average of 8 to 10 years to qualify for a regulated rental. To be specific, Stockholm, and in general all of Sweden, has a strong housing system with regulated prices with which the government aims to ensure cheap and accessible housing for everyone. The problem? The problem is that with regulated prices so far below market values, everyone wants to rent a cheap house in the city centre. And there is simply not enough supply. There are not enough houses for rent for everyone to have their own. And the way the government solves this is by creating huge waiting lists. Lists that lead to people having to wait even more than 2 decades until they can finally access their regulated rent. As you can see, no matter how cheap the rent is, if people have nowhere to live, it's not really a solution either. However, stop. Let's just stop for a moment. Because what if I told you that there is a way to regulate prices without necessarily leaving anyone without a house? What if I told you that it is not entirely true that in Stockholm, everyone has to wait 8 or 10 years to find a house, and anyone who wants to can rent a home tomorrow in the Swedish capital? Well, listen up.
Want a house? Just pay for it.
By the way, before we go on, take a look at this graph. Do you know that more than 70% of the people watching Visualeconomik are not yet subscribed to the channel? If you like the economy, current affairs, and you don't want to miss more videos like this one, hit the subscribe button. Well, let's recap. So far, we've said that price controls have two main consequences. Firstly, prices do indeed start falling. Secondly, the supply is reduced and waiting lists are created. But what if instead of regulating the entire market, only part of it were regulated? In other words, one part of the city could be regulated to give citizens access to cheap housing, and at the same time, another part of the city could be left unregulated, so that whoever wants to can skip the waiting lists. Well, that's exactly what is done in Sweden. The huge waiting lists we have shown you affect only 50% of the rental market. The remaining 50% is free of regulated prices. Thanks to this, those who do not mind waiting a few years end up having a very, very cheap rent, and those who are less patient can rent an apartment at high prices without having to wait. Come on, I think it's the perfect solution to all the problems, don't you think? Well, let's not go too fast because this measure may not be as perfect as it seems. Cast an eye on this news.
Sweden is the only European country where fatal shootings have risen significantly since 2000, leaping from one of the lowest rates of gun violence on the continent to one of the highest in less than a decade, a report has found.
We already talk about it in one of our videos on Visualpolitik. Sweden is becoming the epicenter of gun violence in Europe. In that video, we explained that this huge increase in violence was caused in large part by the creation of ghettos and armed gangs. And you know what? There are theories that point to the fact that this whole criminal phenomenon and the creation of ghettos could be closely related to the regulated housing policy in Sweden. Although, yes, I know what you're thinking. What on earth does crime have to do with housing? And what does it have to do with the fact that some rents are regulated and others are not? Well, the answer lies in the fact that, as counterintuitive as it may seem, it is precisely the richest and not the poorest who benefit from rent regulations. Check it out. This graph shows the amount of savings that citizens obtained from rent regulation. The left column represents the savings gleaned by the poorest 25% of the Swedish population, while the right column represents those of the richest 25%. Specifically, according to the authors of the study, from which we have obtained these data, the richest Swedes achieved savings up to 30% higher than those of the poorest Swedes. And you may be wondering, how is that possible? In principle, rent regulation serves to benefit the poorest and not the other way around. Well, Visualeconomik viewers, the key is, once again, in the waiting lists. Think about it. If you are Swedish and you want a house in a central neighborhood with little conflict, with access to services and infrastructure, and at a ridiculous price, then you will have to apply for a house in an area with these characteristics. What is the problem? The problem is that everyone wants to live in a home in those types of neighborhoods. This means that waiting lists are much higher in the quality areas than in the suburban areas where there is less security and convenience. So if you have the money to pay a very expensive unregulated rent, and you can afford to wait up to 20 years to be granted a regulated home in the best neighborhood in Stockholm, no problem. But if, on the other hand, you are, for example, a newly arrived immigrant, a person with few resources, or someone very young without family support, your only alternative will be to ask for a regulated apartment in the worst neighborhoods of Sweden. In this way, poor and troubled neighborhoods become poorer and poorer, creating the infamous ghettos, which are the perfect breeding ground for criminal gangs. In other words, waiting lists can lead to a worrying segregation of society. Still, let's be clear, Sweden is a very unusual case. Much of the regulated housing is public, and waiting lists are regulated by the government. What would happen if instead there were price controls, but no waiting lists? What would happen if there were capped prices, but having an apartment did not depend on a list of the government of the day? Well, these exact questions bring us back to the San Francisco case. In that case, there were no waiting lists. The housing was divided between a regulated and an unregulated part, and the housing went to the first person who saw the ad first. The question is, what happened next? Well, many of the owners of the regulated housing, after seeing that they could not rent their homes for the same money as before, decided to sell their apartments. By doing so, the population living in rented housing dropped to 21% in some neighborhoods, while the population living in their own homes increased to 12%. In other words, tenant neighborhoods were transformed into homeowner neighborhoods. And naturally, for people who could afford a house, perfect, no problem. But once again, for people with few resources, that change forced them to move to more affordable and lower quality areas. And take note, because that's not the end of the story. Remember how we told you that rent regulation could reduce investment and housing quality? Well, San Francisco regulators knew that, and to avoid it, they offered homeowners who refurbished their homes the possibility of bypassing the regulation and charging higher prices. After that, many homeowners started to renovate all their apartments at once. This served to significantly improve the quality of the homes, but also greatly increased their rental price. Conclusion: some neighborhoods began to be occupied by people with higher purchasing power who could afford higher quality apartments. This, in turn, pushed people with fewer resources, who could no longer afford the price of the renovated homes, away from the central neighborhoods. As we told you before, for every law, there is a loophole. In any case, the curious thing about all this is that what we have just told you almost exclusively affected homes in areas with rising prices and homes where tenants had been living for only a short time. However, tenants who kept their homes after the regulation and who had already been living there for a long time benefited greatly from the measure. They achieved not only cheap rents, but there were up to 20% higher tenancy rates than those in unregulated areas. As with most public interventions, there are always winners and losers. The winners of rent control are those who, after the regulation, already have housing and manage to keep it. Those who do not have to put up with waiting lists and do not have to move to worse neighborhoods. They can pay cheaper rents and live much better. In that sense, the measure is a success. However, on the other hand, the losers are the tenants who, after price regulation, do not have affordable housing because the supply is reduced. Those who are forced to move to marginal neighborhoods and landlords with fewer benefits and incentives to rent. In conclusion, it is not that rent control is useless, but that it is a measure that favors some in exchange for harming others. And it is far from clear that the most disadvantaged are the richest. So then, what's going on? Does everything the government does have problems and is wrong? Is there no policy capable of reducing the price of rents without causing other big problems? Well, in fact, yes there is, or rather there are. Although we will talk about them in a future video. Suffice to say that all is not lost when faced with the problem of rentals. However, until we make that video, it's your turn. Do you think that it's worth controlling prices in exchange for the possible detrimental effects? Are there cases of regulations like the ones we have seen in your city? What other measures can you think of to curb the rise in rental prices? You can leave your answers in the comments. If you like the video, like it, activate the little bell so you don't miss any of the following videos, and see you in the next one. All the best, see you soon.